everybody. Let's start our meeting. I'd like to start with two announcements. This Sunday, March 18th, there's going to be a board meeting downstairs at 10 o'clock in the morning. And this coming April 7th, a Saturday night, we're going to have a benefit for the Permanent Site Committee at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel where Baba stayed when he was in Hollywood. And your reservations need to be sent in by the end of March in order to reserve space. Is there any other announcement that needs to be made right now? Yeah?
That was April 9th?
April 7th. Yeah. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I'd like to do a reading of Baba's discourse from the Everything and Nothing, his first discourse, which is called The Lover and the Beloved. God is love, and love must love. And to love, there must be a beloved. But since God is existence infinite and eternal, there is no one for him to love but himself. And in order to love himself, he must imagine himself as the beloved, whom he as the lover imagines he loves. Beloved and lover implies separation, and separation creates longing, and longing causes search. And the wider and the more intense the search, the greater the separation, and the more terrible the longing. When longing is most intense, separation is complete, and the purpose of separation, which was that love might experience itself as lover and beloved, is fulfilled, and union follows. And when union is attained, the lover knows that he himself was all along the beloved whom he loved and desired union with, and that all the impossible situations that he overcame were obstacles which he himself had placed in the path to himself. To attain union is so impossibly difficult because it is impossible to become what you already are. Union is nothing other than knowledge of oneself as the only one. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
As I'm sure many of you know, we have a very special guest tonight who's visiting us from the Bay Area. His name is Alain Youell. Alain is a psychologist, a nutritional counselor, a lecturer. He's involved in projects concerning special education and has appeared on TV. He had the good fortune to meet Meher Baba in 1959 when he lived with him for 3 weeks. And after that, he didn't see Baba again in the physical body, although he had correspondence with Baba for a long time after that. Before the time of meeting Baba, Alain was a dancer and a puppeteer. But after a long time with Baba, he went into psychology. Since that first visit to India, Alain has been back 2 times, and he has just returned from his second visit with a very, very interesting story. I'm very happy to introduce Alain Youell.
Okay?
Yes.
Gracious, lights. Let there be light, let there be everything. Now, if we could do that in Tuna occasionally and Naga, it would make life a lot easier. Help, I feel like David Frost is descending. Well, first of all, I'd like to say Jai Baba to everybody. It's delightful to be here. The last time I came and talked to a group in Southern California was in Pasadena many years ago, and a lot of things have happened to all of us since that period of time. What I'd like to do tonight is to try and share with you some of my experiences of going to Baba in the first time and what Baba has meant in my life and the way my life is focused, hopefully, on a 24-hour-a-day basis on Baba. I've just had some very interesting and very moving experiences this time in India, which was really fascinating, and it looks as if I'll be going back again in August, so I guess my connection with India is still very strong. I went to India, first of all, in the end of 1959, and recently I was down visiting with my friends the Overtons, and they'd left on the bed the family letters, which I hadn't read for ages and ages, and I opened it up at the page and I started reading it, and it said Mani was saying that they were awaiting the last visitors of the year, Don Stevens and his cousin Alain Youell, and we were coming on a visit to be with Baba for Christmas. And of course that brought back a flood of memories. and I was going back to that particular Christmas when we went. I have to tell you that any journey that I go on, the Lady Maya always manages to come on with me, and I always think that one of these days I'm going to have a nice quiet trip somewhere, and it almost inevitably never happens. I mean, even coming down today from Oakland, San Francisco Airport was closed down, so thereby Oakland Airport was closed down, and we just had to sit at the end of the runway in frustration for about 45 minutes until they allowed us to take off. And it's all those little things that are always there and always present. So the trip to Baba, Don and I were living in Holland at that particular time, and I went off to see my family in England and wish them all Merry Christmas. And I went out to the airport, a very cold, damp, but not foggy, very wet night in London, and met a friend who was coming in from the States and visited with her for a while and her parents, and went out to get on board the plane. And they had just introduced a new twin-engine plane called a Caravel. Jets were still relatively innovative in 1959. All of us don't think anything of getting on a jet nowadays, but in those days they were still fairly new. So we all got off the bus and boarded the plane, and they started up all the motors and all the lights went out and the plane filled with smoke. So they evacuated us very fast, and we all shot down the stairs and stood out in the freezing cold and wet night. And eventually the bus came along and we all sat and stood in the buses. And after that we all got back in the plane again, and they started up the motors, and there was the most horrendous roar and clatter at the back. And in the interim they parked a Pakistani International Airlines Super Connie right behind the tail, and not realizing the force of the jet motors, it had blown half the tail off the Super Constellation. Well, Don and I were due to have dinner in Paris, and we eventually got a very late supper at midnight, but I made it to Paris. And while we were having supper, Don said, "I'm sorry, I have some problems with the business that I'm doing, and we won't be able to leave as scheduled tomorrow evening. Would you mind taking the tickets, and you just have to go around to the airlines and see what you can do?" And of course, in those days, we didn't have nice things like computers, which pressed up all the flights from Paris to Bombay and changed everything less than instantaneously. And I was brought very much out of the computer age this last trip to India and dealing with Indian Airlines and traveling across India. And so you had to go from airline to airline. And I still have my ticket, and my ticket at the finish is 18 feet long. All the different pieces and changes that were made and attachments that were made. So I went merrily through Pan Am and TWA and Air France and all the various airlines on the Champs-Élysées, and got us all organised, ready to leave the following day. And I met Don for dinner that evening, and he said, it doesn't look as if we're going to be able to leave until Wednesday. And I muttered a few imprecations under my breath, but I wasn't too concerned, and so I did my stint the following day up and down. And of course, again, in those days, there weren't 2 or 3 flights a day. There was one a week with luck, and so you had to connect various places and bump up and down. But anyway, to cut a very long story short, this went on for 4 days. And each day the airline saw me coming and shut up shop and went on strike. And so eventually we were booked to go on TWA out of Paris very early in the morning, and that's what we got on. And we arrived in Rome, and we checked in for the second part of the flight because there was an equipment change. And the TWA gentleman looked at me and he said, "I'm very sorry, Mr. Youell, but we have a problem. We can't take you. You don't have a visa for Saudi Arabia, and we can't take anybody without a visa to go into Saudi Arabia. They would arrest you, and that would be that." So we were taken off that particular flight. So there we were, suddenly stuck in Rome. But never fear, Qantas is here. And there was a Qantas flight that night that was zooming off with a one-stop to Cairo onto Karachi, and that would connect very easily. So we said, that's wonderful. And so they took us in, and we stayed in a hotel during the day. And about 3 o'clock we called to see whether the flight was on time, and they said, "Well, we have a minor problem, but don't worry about it. We think it's going to leave on time." And at 7 o'clock, when we were supposed to go down and pick up the bus to go to the airport, they announced that there'd been an accident, and a plane had crash-landed on the runway, and it was a Comet, and a Comet is rather a strange plane. It has its engines in the wings, and so there's no leverage. So they couldn't lever it up and get it off the runway. So we sat, and we sat, and we sat, and we sat for 36 hours. And finally, in the pouring rain, they dragged this poor plane off the runway, and finally took us out very late in the night to board the flight, finally going onward towards India. And as we got in the plane, we boarded it, and they shut the doors, and it was in the days when you climbed up again the stairs. And they started up the motors, and we started to taxi, and all of a sudden I heard them cut back the motors, and we turned around and started to taxi back, and they opened one of the doors and threw up a very elegant mink coat and came through the cabin saying, "Has anybody left this mink behind?" And my seat companion had, and they shut the door again and we took off. Well, when we got to Cairo, the captain announced that we could either sit on the plane and refuel very fast, because they were redoing the runway in Karachi for the jets. The jets just started going through Karachi, so the plane with one voice said, "Yes, let's." And there were a lot of poor Australians who were desperate to get home for Christmas and obviously weren't going to make it, but they were doing their best. And so we took off and we were sped through the night, and we watched the dawn come up, and everybody was sitting geared to their watches and wondering what was going on and were we ever going to make it. And finally the Pakistani authorities took pity on us, which they don't do anymore, but they did in those days, and they let us come in and land. And so we landed, and they sprayed the plane as they do in case you had yellow fever or some obnoxious disease, and we sat in that for about 10 minutes. And we got off the plane and trotted through, and I trotted through and stood outside, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. I waited half an hour, and I waited 45 minutes, and finally an hour I went back in to see where Don was. Well, Don wasn't going to be allowed into Pakistan because he was an American citizen and he didn't have a visa. There was no way they were going to let him in. And so eventually, after much haggling and arguing and doing a little bit of British temperament, I finally agreed to stand surety for him, and so they kept his passport and he was allowed in. Unfortunately, there was some sort of a conflict at that time between India and Pakistan, and they didn't tell us there was an Indian Airlines flight leaving immediately. So we had to wait yet another day to get to spend our time with Baba, and so we had to spend Christmas Day in Karachi, and we flew on the next day to Bombay to be greeted by Maji and various other Baba lovers and whisked up to Pune. So we arrived almost a week late, but Baba was, as always, very sweet and loving and extended our stay so we could stay longer with him. And we arrived absolutely exhausted at the hotel in Pune and sank into bed, and the next day went off to Meherabad. Now, a little part of the story is that I really had, I guess, what you might call doubts. I really wasn't sure of who Baba was or what was going on and what my mad cousin was up to. And, you know, Americans are very susceptible to things and they get carried away with their enthusiasm sometime. And I thought, well, maybe, you know, I can protect him from himself or something. And I remember just so clearly driving in Baba's car up to Meherabad, and getting out of the car, and various of the Mandali coming out to greet us, and most of them, of course, knew Don. And we walked into Mandali Hall, and as we walked into the Mandali Hall, Baba walked in at the other end. And he immediately walked straight up to me and just gathered me into his arms, and I just sat on the floor and cried. And it was just so apparent to me that finally, after obviously many, many lifetimes of search, that I had found the one thing that I wanted most of all, and that was God. And it was just so wonderful to sit there and be held, and it was almost like I could wear off 1,001 lifetimes and 1,001 instances just being with him. And the stay with Baba was absolutely fascinating. I always talk of Baba talking to me, and we had conversations. And in essence, this is what happened, either through verbal communication from me to him, or in the sense of he communicated so strongly with the heart that after a few days of being around him, you were used to the majority of the signs, and he would give you the sign. In other words, he would talk to you, and you would respond, and if you didn't respond right, he would do the gesture again until you responded in the right modality, or that you understood what was going on. And he did this with me many times, and I had several times when I was totally alone with Baba, and Baba would talk to me, and I would interpret, and if I didn't interpret right, he'd make me go backwards and forwards until I got the right interpretation. And it was an absolutely fascinating experience. So when I talk of Baba talking to me, that's what I'm talking about. One of the first things that was so fascinating was that we spent the first 3 days in Meherabad in Dr. Duncan's cottage, which was a really beautiful experience being there. And then the rest of the time we were at Meherabad, across from Mandali Hall in what is one of the little rooms right next to what used to be the generating unit. So we had the generator going in the early evening to get what electric light there was. The other thing that was so amazing was the care that Baba took, and he still does, but he certainly did then. You would come in the morning and Baba would ask if you had eaten properly, if you'd slept properly, if your stomach was all right, if you'd been to the bathroom, if everything was okay. And heaven help you if you didn't respond, in the sense of he really wanted to know. It was like being taken care of to the nth degree. It wasn't just as we all say to each other, you know, how are you doing? And you're not really interested in knowing that. Because, you know, you're much more interested in getting your point of view or your thing across. Gee, I'm sick today, or I feel terrible, or you don't really want to listen to what the other person has to say. But Baba was really genuinely interested. And if you didn't tell him, he would repeat the same thing again until you said, well, gee, no, I've got a bit of a headache this morning, or no, I didn't sleep very well, I was thinking about you, or I was worried about something. And he was very smart in the sense with me, I had something in the back of my mind which I was very worried about. And every morning, Baba would used to say to me, now, is anything bothering you? And I'd say, bothering me, Baba? No, I'm here with you. Why should anything bother me? And he would say, nod and smile and say, okay. And then later on during the day, he'd be smiling or we'd be talking about something and he'd say, now, is anything bothering you? And I'd say, no, Baba, why should anything bother me? Excuse me. And this would go on and on. So finally, on the third day, in the very late